And Belly says,
What if you only love me because that's what your mom wanted and then your mom died?
it might seem at first like a very nonsensical worry that doesn't really have any grounding in logic, but when you think about it, it actually makes perfect sense why she might feel this way. I think Belly's fears are rooted around two main reasons. One is her realization that her and Jeremiah bonded a lot over Susanna's death and their shared grief, and the second is her long-standing insecurities surrounding Conrad and whether or not she can believe and allow herself to believe that he truly loves her. Belly has spent the better part of the last year trying to heal from what happened with her and Jeremiah, and when they called off their wedding, they had a conversation surrounding the ways in which they came together during a period of intense grief right after Susanna passed away. Belly even talks about how they put each other back together again.
Jer, after your mom died, you and I, we put each other back together. We did that, you and me. And you're a part of me now. I don't know where I end and where you began.
So that scene is extremely telling because we can see how Belly and Jeremiah really bonded over their shared grief about losing Susanna. We know that Susanna was Jeremiah's mother, so obviously that grief is very inherent in his experience of losing her. But Susanna was kind of a maternal figure to Belly as well. She was her mother's closest friend, and we hear a lot throughout the series of how much Susanna meant to Belly. I think not a lot of attention is given to how much Belly must have grieved for losing Susanna as well. Yes, she wasn't actually her mother, but we could see how close she was with Susanna. And we saw that Belly had a really hard time accepting how sick Susanna really was, and so it's really easy to see how heavily it must have hit Belly when Susanna passed away. Belly and Jeremiah coming together in a time that was so full of grief, I think caused that grief to almost act as sort of like this string or this glue that was actually holding them together. Like I said, Belly says in that scene that they put each other back together and she doesn't know where she ends and he begins. And there's been a lot of talk about how this is actually kind of a codependent dynamic in a relationship. But, you know, at the time they were deep in that grief, they were both quite young, and that was how they moved through their grief together. It doesn't actually mean that they made for a very healthy partnership or that they were meant to be together. It means that they were able to provide each other something that they both needed at that time, which was comfort and understanding. I also think that at the time that Belly and Jeremiah came together, Jeremiah was able to kind of give her something that Conrad wasn't at that time, which was this kind of emotional vulnerability over losing his mother. So the connection is she doesn't want to repeat that pattern with Conrad. Belly knows how deeply Conrad loved Susanna and how close they were, and even though he didn't really share his grief with her directly at that time, because that was right after they broke up and then he left for California, there's no way Belly doesn't know how hard he grieved for Susanna. Belly also knows how much Susanna wanted her to end up with, as she says, one of her boys, but it was kind of clear that Susanna seemed to think that Belly and Conrad would be the ones who ended up together. And so it really isn't the craziest thing that Belly could be worried that Conrad's love comes from sort of knowing that his mother had that wish and that desire, and with his mother no longer here, Belly might be worried that Conrad feels that if he can fulfill, you know, that wish that Susanna had, it keeps him close to Susanna. I'm not saying this is true or that it's actually how Conrad feels. I'm just kind of trying to explain what I think was going through Belly's head in that moment. There's also kind of the important aspect of timing that I haven't seen a lot of people mention. And what I mean by that is Conrad finally kind of opens up about his feelings for Belly in season 1, right after everybody learns that Susanna was sick. And I think this is important because with this fear that Belly has that Conrad might only love her because of Susanna, I think she really associates that time when Conrad finally confessed his feelings for her in season 1 with a lot of influence of Susanna's illness around that. So she might be wondering if Conrad's feelings for her are going to come and go and fluctuate depending on where he is on his grief journey with losing his mother. For anyone who's ever lost someone, you know that grief is not linear. It's not the type of thing that just goes away. You have good days and bad days, good months and bad months, good years and bad years. It's something that's with you for the rest of your life. And Belly might be wondering, based on the fact that Conrad only initially confessed his feelings for her in season 1 right after, you know, Susanna said that she was going to seek treatment for her cancer. Belly might be wondering if Conrad's feelings for her and love for her is always going to fluctuate depending on where he is with his grief journey regarding losing his mom. And to build on that concept, Conrad really heavily pulled away when he was deep in the throes of his grief when Susanna was, you know, didn't have much time left and when she actually did pass away. And so Belly could be scared that if Conrad's grief comes and goes throughout, you know, their lifetime, which it will, that his feelings for her will come and go as well. And, you know, with anything the Summer I Turned Pretty, there's always a lot of back and forth and dialogue. And some people I don't think are fully sort of convinced that Belly and Jeremiah in large part got together because of what happened with Susanna and their shared grief. But to kind of dig into that, I need to point back to this scene in season 2.
I hate that I let you down.
It happened so fast, Billy. It was really, really bad. I had Dad and Conrad sort of, but I needed you, and you just weren't there. You left me.
I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere.
So we can see that Belly feels immense guilt over the fact that Jeremiah feels like she was not there for him fully when his mom passed away. And this kind of ties into the video that I posted yesterday where I said that I don't believe Belly has ever been the villain. Yes, she's made some mistakes just like any of the other characters, but she has actually taken a lot of accountability and shown a lot of regret over some of the decisions that she made. And I think the fact that she had those feelings caused her to feel really, really bad about the fact that she, Jeremiah ended up feeling like she wasn't there for him after Susanna passed away. Watching that scene we just watched in season 2, it's really hard to deny that that probably played a little bit of a role in what caused them to initially start to connect over their grief for Susanna. So that provides a little bit of background context of why Belly is kind of afraid to repeat the pattern that she kind of created with Jeremiah, with Conrad. She's really projecting what she went through with Jeremiah and, already knowing what it feels like to try to heal from a relationship that had a lot of shared grief and a lot of, what's called trauma bonding. And she doesn't want to do that again with Conrad. I think she knows that it would be harder for her to heal from that scenario with Conrad. We have talked a lot about how the reason why Belly said to Conrad that, he'll never be to her what Jeremiah is simply because the way she feels for Conrad is so much more intense than with Jeremiah. That was something that we talked about a lot after his beach confession scene. And I think that concept really applies here. She's thinking about how hard it was to kind of recognize what it felt like to heal from a relationship where grief was the driving factor or, the biggest factor keeping you together. And I think deep down she feels like she wouldn't be able to heal from that dynamic with Conrad if they were to, get back together and then realize that it was only based on shared grief. I think she really fears having to heal from that and feeling like she probably simply couldn't. So now back, here we are in season 3, episode 11. Conrad replies to Belly with this.
You think that I love you because when I was 6 years old, my mother thought that we should get married?
No, that's not what I mean. I mean...
And it's interesting because as Conrad says that, he's kind of looking at Belly as though what she said is a little bit crazy, but it really exemplifies the fact that the two of them are kind of, to some extent, living under different belief systems and different almost realities as it pertains to how they see the things that have unfolded in their relationship. And I saw Chris Briney answer an interview question about this part, and he says this.
What I find interesting about it is they both had these thoughts and made decisions about the situation and about what it is and labeled it with all these things, and then you say it out loud and the other person's like, what? That's so ridiculous, that's so out of left field. And I think that's a nice thing as a human to be I've been thinking about all this stuff, and the other person's I was never once thinking about that. It's sort of refreshing to make those discoveries.
And it's just so fascinating because it's such a good point. This fear that's really consuming Belly's mind in this moment isn't even on Conrad's radar because that's not how he feels. And it shows us how Belly is really just convincing herself of something that, she believes it's the truth and she believes it's reality. And for Conrad, that's just not the case. It's not something that even really occurred to him. And yet it's keeping them apart. And it doesn't mean that Belly's out of her mind or anything like that. It just means that those fears are so strong for her and they're driving a lot of her insecurities. And so speaking of insecurities, you may remember at the beginning of this video, I said there's 2 main factors at play. One is Belly's fear that Conrad's grief over losing Susanna is keeping him tied to Belly, and the second was Belly's insecurities. So the next thing Belly says in this scene is going to lead us perfectly into that conversation about Belly's lingering insecurities around Conrad and the way that he feels about her.
If your mom hadn't gotten sick again, would we have even gotten together? Or would you just have gone off to football camp that summer? And never look twice at me again.
And once again, as Belly is saying this, you kind of see the look on Conrad's face, and it's none of this even occurred to him, and yet it feels so real and true for Belly. And there's a line in there when she says, would you just have never looked twice at me again? And I just think that line is so telling. It comes back to one of the central themes of the show and even the title that the show is based on, where Belly seems to have always had this fear or this insecurity that before she was quote unquote pretty, she wasn't deserving of Conrad's attention, or that Conrad only developed feelings for her once she, again, quote unquote, turned pretty. We see all of these flashbacks of Belly and you can see that she was always a beautiful girl, but we can all relate to those insecurities of thinking that you're not enough and thinking that your value is tied up in the way that you look and not even being able to see yourself accurately. And those insecurities have hung over Belly for so long, so much so to the point that when we saw so many flashbacks throughout this series where it was very clear that, Conrad cared so much about Belly and began to develop love for her long before she, blossomed into the beautiful young woman that she is now. Again, like I said, she was always beautiful. But those insecurities just were so ingrained in Belly that she was not able to see all of these really, really clear signs that he did have feelings for her. And deep down inside, she still has those same fears. And they're very tangled up in her idea that Conrad only loves her because Susanna wanted him to. The two seem separate, but they're not very separate at all. She's worried that Conrad only loves her because that was Susanna's wish. And the only reason she's able to so firmly believe that is because she still has those insecurities about herself, that she's not lovable or that Conrad doesn't see her that way. Belly's insecurities are leading her to believe that Conrad's love for her could be conditional. And then she says this.
You know, if we didn't lose Susanna, would it loom so large for us?
And I think in this moment when Belly says that, we really see how heavily Susanna's death affected everybody. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I think it's kind of overlooked how much it affected Belly, because Belly wasn't actually her daughter. But we can see here how heavily everything has been weighing on her and how it's kind of permeated so many different aspects of her life and the way she viewed her relationship with Jeremiah and how she is potentially viewing a future relationship with Conrad. Susanna kind of left behind this heavy legacy that lives both inside Jeremiah and Conrad. And I think Belly, if she were to proceed with a relationship with Conrad, she wants it to be based on mutual, genuine love and not on Conrad kind of fulfilling this obligation that Belly feels he, promised to Susanna, whether that was directly or indirectly. And it kind of ties back to something really interesting that Conrad said earlier in this episode here.
And I can guarantee you that whatever promises we made back then, nobody would hold you to them today.
So I've seen a lot of dialogue about that scene that I just showed, that line that Conrad just said about no one's going to hold you to the promises we made when we were younger. And a lot of people have been kind of wondering which promises he was actually referring to. And now I know that Conrad didn't directly make any sort of promise to Susanna that he would, be with Belly. But I can't help but sort of tie these two pieces together and think that there might be a part of Belly that believes that Conrad, whether directly or indirectly, made some type of promise to Susanna that he would fulfill her, quote unquote, wish to be with Belly, even though I don't think Susanna directly said that. Yes, it was heavily implied. But the reason I tie it back to that scene is I think it's important that Conrad said to Belly that, nobody's going to hold anyone to these promises, because if that is what Belly believes, Conrad choosing her is actually more impactful after he makes that statement to her that no one's holding anyone to these promises, because she will know that he actually wants to be with her, and it's not because he made some sort of indirect promise to Susanna that he would be with her. So I'm not sure if anyone else picked up on that. Let me know if I'm kind of out of left field with that theory, but I think that statement it could be perceived a lot of different ways because, Jeremiah and Conrad both made promises to Susanna on her deathbed, but I definitely think it can be tied back to this conversation here that Belly and Conrad are having, and the fact that Belly is so worried about the reasons why Conrad might love her. So then Conrad replies to Belly with this.
That is not why I love you. I have tried everything not to love you. For the sake of Jer, for the sake of not dragging you down with me in my grief, I fought it. Way before the summer that my mom got sick. You've always been a precious person to me. I've always cared about you. And then at some point, I started to see you differently, and that scared me because I didn't want things between us to change. But the way that I feel about you, Belly, has nothing to do with my mom.
That whole monologue from Conrad was just one of my favorite scenes in this entire episode, and I just had so many favorite scenes from this entire episode because it was so good. But Chris Briney's delivery was just incredible. I cried a lot during this scene. I think Conrad was very vulnerable in this scene, and he said so many things that are so important. He says that I have tried to stop loving you and I've tried to fight it for all these reasons. He lists Jeremiah as a reason. We all know that he thought that, Belly and Jeremiah had this great relationship, and while he thought that, he did stay away. And then he also says he tried to fight it for the sake of not pulling Belly down with him in his grief. And I thought this was just so fascinating because it shows once again how they both did love each other, but they were kind of living in different realities and had very different perceptions of what was going on. Belly wanted him to sort of let him in on his grief. And to be honest, when they were together the first time, she didn't really even know the extent to her grief because, like he said, he tried not to pull her down with him in it. And I think that was actually a mistake on Conrad's part. In trying to protect her, he actually pushed her away. Whereas from his perspective, because he loved her so much, he didn't want to drag her down in his grief. And he kind of addresses both of Belly's fears here, her fear that he only loves her because Susanna wanted him to, and her insecurities. So I think he kind of speaks directly to her insecurities that have been present around her feelings for Conrad her whole life, where he says that I was fighting it long before the summer that my mom got sick. When he tells her that she's always been a precious person to him, which I just loved that line so much. It's really kind of confirmation of what we all suspected, that Belly turning pretty had nothing to do with Conrad's feelings for her. He's always felt that way for her. And it's, kind of understandable that they had this lifelong friendship. They were childhood friends, and that him developing feelings for her at some point along the line would scare him because he doesn't want the dynamic to change. And everybody knows when you date, there's a chance you could break up. And if, you started out as friends, that's kind of a scary thought to think that I could lose this person in any capacity. And I love how firmly he says this.
But the way that I feel about you, Belly, has nothing to do with my mom.
Because I think he can see how much this is eating away at her. And we saw a lot in this episode how Conrad is finally just kind of standing true in his feelings for Belly. In the past, he has not been communicative. We all know that. I'm definitely a Team Conrad girl. I have been since day one, but it's okay to admit he hasn't always been communicative, and that's been an issue in their relationship. But here in this episode, he's kind of like, I'm going to speak my truth. This is my chance. I came all the way to Paris. I didn't do this for nothing. I'm going to say what I need to say loud and clear. And he does that here when he says, the way that I feel about you has nothing to do with my mom. And he uses her name, and he says it in kind of this very sort of firm way. Like he really wants him to hear her, where he's saying, look, I hear you. You have these kind of fears, but I'm telling you, this is not something that has been on my mind. And I really love this next thing he says here.
If I met you for the first time tonight, I would love you.
Come on, Conrad. I mean, how do you know that?
Because I've changed everything about myself, and the one thing that never changes is that I love you.
So the two things he says there that I love so much, one is that if I met you tonight for the first time, I would love you. I think that's just such a beautiful concept that, he's telling her that he loves her so much that it has nothing to do with their past. That we've seen this argument a lot that their relationship is rooted in nostalgia. I don't agree with that. And I think he's kind of addressing that here, where he says, yes, I've loved you based on this kind of lifetime friendship that we've had, but it's not just that. I love who you are today. She spent this year in Paris, and we've seen a lot of kind of changes in Belly, and he's saying, I don't just love who you were back then. I love what I see of you now. And then the other thing he says that I loved so much was that, he says, I've changed everything about myself. And the one thing that hasn't changed is that I love you. I thought this was so beautiful too, because we've seen so many changes in Conrad. If we look at Conrad in season 1 to where he is today, he is a completely different person. We've talked a lot about his growth and his character arc, and he's kind of addressing that here and saying, look at how much I've changed in all of these years. We both have, he just addresses that, but I still love you. That is the one thing about me that's never going to change. And I think he's addressing both of Belly's fears here. Like I said, he's addressing the fact that she's scared that he only loves her because Susanna wanted him to, by saying, I'm still going to love you no matter what, no matter where I am in my grief journey, I'm still going to love you. No matter how I view Susanna's death and how that may change throughout time, I'm still going to love you. And then he's also addressing her just basic insecurities that she's always had about herself, that, Conrad couldn't love her, by basically saying, yes, I can, and I do, and I always will. And Belly says this to Conrad.
Conrad, I wish that I could be as sure as you. But I can't.
And it's funny because I actually think I perceived this line very differently from a lot of people. A lot of people seem to think she's saying that I wish I could be as sure as you, as in I wish I could love you as much as you're saying you love me, but I can't. And that's not at all how I perceived it when I watched this, not on the first time nor any of my many rewatches. I took it as her saying, I wish I could be as sure as you are that you love me, but I'm not. Does that kind of make sense? Like, I took it as her saying that Conrad is telling her how much he loves her, and she wishes she could feel reassured in that, and she wishes she could see the truth in that, but she's just not there yet. I didn't take it as her saying, I'm not as sure that I love you. Please tell me if anybody else took it that way, because the way I'm perceiving it, to me, obviously, makes a lot more sense. And I don't think she was saying, I don't love you, or I'm not sure I love you. She was saying, I'm still insecure about, feeling certain that you love me. So then they say this to each other.
Sorry.
I'm not.
And Conrad is saying that he's not sorry. I think he feels like it was all, worth it, even though they're kind of in this moment right now where they're both sort of in pain, and this is very heartbreaking. They've had this, beautiful day together and this wonderful night together, and there was a lot of tension and buildup that led to it, and he's just not sorry. And it reminds me actually of this scene.
I need you to know that whatever happens, it was worth it to me. Being with you, loving you, it was all worth it.
Conrad has remained, very steadfast throughout the season in his assertion that he believes it was all worth it with Belly. And so these two scenes kind of reminded me of each other, because he's essentially saying the same thing to Belly, that, even if this falls apart and doesn't work out, I'm not sorry that we've had this time together. It was all worth it to me. And it is such a reassurance of how much he loves her. And I think if Belly was kind of not caught up in all of her insecurities, she could piece it all together and see that as well. And another thought that I had throughout this entire scene was kind of remembering how heavily it affected Belly at the end of season 2, when Conrad told her that he had feelings for her still, and then took it back the next morning. Even though he explained to her on the beach in his love confession why he did that, I think because that affected Belly so heavily, it has really stuck with her. So I think there's actually a part of her who, even though she found out right before she was set to marry Jeremiah that Conrad still loved her, I think here in Paris a year later, there's a part of her who she might have been expecting over that past year for his love to, go away again, even though he clarified to her that it never went away. So I definitely think there's a part of her that still kind of clings to that, again, insecurity that it's going to be like a push-pull type of relationship and he's going to take it away. And I think it's probably a little bit overwhelming for her to realize that her beliefs around all of that are not true. And her beliefs are kind of crumbling, that, hey, look, Conrad still does love me. Not only that, but he has become more kind of open about it and communicative about it. And, you know, he's not holding back. Conrad and Belly had a lot of dialogue, both leading up to this scene that I just dissected and afterwards that I want to kind of dive into separately. I think there was just so much to unpack in this episode that it makes more sense to me to go through it bit by bit so that my videos don't get crazy long. But I had a ton of requests to specifically get into why Belly may have felt that Conrad only loves her because of Susanna. And this was kind of my take on it. I think there's been a lot of interesting takes on it. So I would love to hear everybody's input and what you thought when you were watching the scene and how you perceive Belly's feelings here, because I think it's really layered and it's interesting to kind of piece together everything that's happened throughout the series that's led up to Belly having this fear.